So I'm here with Benedict Rogers, who's the Chief Executive of Hong Kong Watch, and their latest report is called The Crackdown on Media Freedom in Hong Kong. Hi Ben, this report from Hong Kong Watch, it says the freedom of press in Hong Kong is dire. Just how hard is it to be a journalist in Hong Kong now compared to like 5 or 10 years ago?
I think it's extremely hard for two reasons. Firstly, there are so many new restrictions from the government, particularly under the national security law, so it's incredibly dangerous to report stories that might upset the government or might be critical of the government. But it's also challenging because people are now afraid to talk to the media. So for journalists, particularly foreign correspondents, they have real difficulty finding sources. And what we've seen over the last 3 years or so since 2019 is a combination of, which this report documents, police brutality against journalists, police raids of newsrooms, the closure of Apple Daily and Stan News, and then more kind of subtle but still very draconian rules, for example, restricting access to public records and the weaponization of visas for foreign correspondents. A number of foreign correspondents have not had their visas renewed. So all of that put together means that the press freedom situation in Hong Kong is, as we say, dire.
And I saw that you had written in the report that you've authored that the definition of journalist in Hong Kong has changed as well. So what's that changed to?
Yes, so the government has basically said, or I think it's the police actually, have said that they will no longer recognise media press cards, media accreditation that hasn't come from the government. And they've taken that a stage further to say basically the government will only issue accreditation to kind of recognised mainstream media outlets. So that will mean that freelance journalists, for example, may very well find it difficult to get accreditation. Student journalists, of which there are quite a number in Hong Kong who are quite actively reporting issues for student newspapers, they're unlikely to get accredited, and possibly other media that the government doesn't like. So they're redefining the definition through issuing their own accreditation and not recognising any other accreditation.
And what's the new fake news law that might come into force?
So we still haven't seen very much detail of this, but a number of government officials, including the Chief Executive Carrie Lam, the new Chief Executive John Lee, who up until recently was the Chief Secretary and then the Security Secretary, and also the current Security Secretary Chris Tang, have all spoken about wanting to tackle fake news. Now, obviously, the issue really is how do you define fake news? Fake news, if it's really fake news, of course, few of us would object to wanting to counter that. But to legislate in order to define fake news usually means further restrictions on news reporting, and that's very worrying. But we do have to wait and see what the detail is.
And I know, as the founder of Hong Kong Watch, we've spoken about before that the Hong Kong police recently said you could face 3 years in jail if you were to go to Hong Kong again. What does that tell us about the situation in Hong Kong now?
Well, I think it tells us that the very draconian national security law is not only destroying Hong Kong's freedoms completely, but it is now being used to threaten people far outside Hong Kong. And we always knew this was a possibility because the national security law has an article allowing for extraterritoriality. It basically says it doesn't matter whether or not you're a Hong Kong citizen, whether you're in Hong Kong or elsewhere when you commit a crime. Anyone anywhere in the world can be in violation of the national security law. But now they appear to be trying to put it into practice. They demanded that Hong Kong Watch take down our website, and as you say, failure to comply could mean a prison sentence and a heavy fine. Now, obviously, that can only really be put into action if I pass through Hong Kong, or indeed if they sought extradition from a country that has an extradition agreement. So there's not much they can do to implement it, but I do have to be careful of where I travel and countries that might have extradition agreements. But what it says basically is that they're trying to silence criticism not only in Hong Kong but well beyond its borders.
And what can people in the UK do to help the situation, would you say?
Well, I think A number of things. Firstly, to be aware of what's happening, to follow developments, and to make sure, crucially, that our members of Parliament are kept up to date with what's happening so that they can then put questions to the British government and urge the British government to do more. So I would encourage people to write to your MPs. One of the reasons we're launching the report in Parliament is to generate that attention in Parliament, and then to call on the British government to speak out for press freedom and other freedoms in Hong Kong, to impose sanctions on those responsible for dismantling Hong Kong's freedoms, and also to be willing to act, perhaps to have a fast track system to help journalists in Hong Kong who may be in danger and may need to get out rapidly. We should be offering them sanctuary.
Right. Well, thank you. There was another question I wanted to ask, which was about the head of Human Rights Watch resigning. This is something that I think we're going to cover tonight, actually. So I don't know if you knew him, but do you have any comment on him, his announcement?
Yeah. I never met him personally, but I certainly followed his work, and I know many of his colleagues in Human Rights Watch, and I have huge respect for him and for Human Rights Watch, and indeed work very closely with the organisation. I'm very sad. I think he's been a very inspiring and big figure in the human rights world, and I wasn't expecting him to retire yet, and he will be difficult to replace. Human Rights Watch has both internally a lot of talent, and I'm sure they can attract externally. So I'm sure they will find a good successor, but he will be missed because he's certainly been a person that I think everyone in the human rights field has respected.
Okay, well, thank you very much.